Hello everybody and welcome to Psalm 64, a great psalm where David again is reflecting on the tumult of what it's like to live as the king, but also the king where a lot of people are desiring his own destruction or at least his own demise from a life of godliness. And it does reflect probably a theme that I suspect you have gone through, and some of you may be going through as you listen to this psalm and you feel like you are under spiritual or emotional attack. Now, this is not the attack from within ourselves that David does reflect upon in other psalms. This is the attack from without, from outside of ourselves, from our enemies, or from those who may not be literally our enemies, but are the enemies of God and who enjoy pulling us down. And so verses 1 to 6, which I'm going to read out now, really do speak clearly into this context of spiritual attack, and then the verses that follow are God's response to that spiritual and emotional attack. Psalm 64. For the director of music, a psalm of David. Hear me, my God, as I voice my complaint. Protect my life from the threat of the enemy. Hide me from the conspiracy of the wicked, from the plots of evildoers. They sharpen their tongues like swords and aim cruel words like deadly arrows. They shoot from ambush at the innocent. They shoot suddenly without fear. They encourage evil in each other's plans. They talk about hiding their snares. They say, who will see it? They plot injustice and say, we have devised a perfect plan. Surely the human mind and heart are cunning. But God will shoot them with his arrows. They will suddenly be struck down. He will turn their own tongues against them and bring them to ruin. All who see them will shake their heads in scorn. All people will fear. They will proclaim the works of God and ponder what he has done. The righteous will rejoice in the Lord and take refuge in him. All the upright in heart will glory in him. I'm sure as you heard that psalm read out, you saw the disjunct between verses 6 and 7. Verse 1 to 6 reinforce how our destitution against the spiritual and emotional attacks lies in two senses. First, that because we know the character of God, we sometimes can be surprised about the nature and force of evil and wonder why God's not doing anything about it in our timing. And the second is the great truth. God is stronger than those who stand up against him. So verses 1 to 6 do paint the picture that until God acts, often it can seem like we are being assaulted spiritually or emotionally by those things which drag us away from God. These people deliberately are attacking your sense of Christian identity and trying to remove you from a person who worships God. They lie in ambush for you. They practice evil. Now, they may not do these things always in order to remove you from God. The psalm is painting the picture that these people hurt others, do things for their own ends, and you're the collateral damage. But of course, the damage is done to you as a person. And then verse 7, if you have it in front of you, starts to go on to how God is going to respond. And you'll notice the first thing that David prayed for starts to be answered. He voices his complaint, yes, and that's a good thing. God is a very large complaints department. He can handle it. But unlike some aspects of departments or government services that do receive complaints, it doesn't get filed in the never to be read again drawer. God answers this complaint, and you can see it firstly in verse 7. But God will shoot them with his arrows, not with our arrows. He may use people as his instruments, but God is the actor in bringing justice. Now, this will lead us to wonder, do we want justice only when it's personal vengeance masquerading as justice? No will, of course, be the answer. But quite often, we do feel an acute sense of justice when we have been wronged and don't feel that same sense of justice when God is wronged or when other people we don't know are wronged. It's much easier to feel the slight of fraud and robbery when it's done to you rather than somebody you never know or have never known in a country like Saudi Arabia. When it's personal, it's personal. And so God comments on this in these verses and asks us, are we focused merely on justice when it's me, or justice that actually leads to judgment? We want both, God says. And the type of justice he speaks about in this context, it's the ancient form of lex talionis, which is basically eye for an eye. An eye for an eye. God will give them back what they deserve. And sometimes when you pay people with the instruments of warfare, he uses those instruments against your very self. That's boomerang sin, if you like, in this context. That is, the same insults you throw out at others may come back to you. God will use that instrument of justice against you to demonstrate the folly of your behavior and the righteousness of his judgment. And so God acts that way many, many times, especially in the Old Testament. We can be so fortunate that God doesn't do that with us based on our own sin. If the boomerang of sin literally had to come back at us, it would strike us dead. But it struck Jesus, of course, instead, where the sinfulness of ourselves, instead of paying for our own sin, was paid for by God himself. In the Old Testament here, God is literally saying that these people who deserve judgment will get it because of their refusal to listen to God. And verses 7 onwards do go on about that. God will strike them down, as you can see. He will turn their own tongues against them and bring them to ruin. That's that boomerang sin type idea, that what they do comes back to bite them. All who see them will shake their heads in scorn. That is good. It means the others watching aren't being dragged now into that sin. They're actually seeing it for what it truly is. Sinfulness against God, hurtfulness against God's people, and God is judging them accordingly. And so those who see that, scorn that type of behavior and agree with God's judgment upon it. All people will fear, and they will proclaim God's glory in verses 9 and 10. That is a good thing. Judgment is coming. Sometimes we want justice, but it's masqueraded as vengeance. God takes the justice, and it always is masqueraded as nothing that we could do. Nothing. God does it through his own power. His own power to work righteous judgment, and he does it. And the other one that we haven't touched on yet is the one the New Testament speaks on so clearly, and that is you reap what you sow. A common idea in the Old and New Testament. That is, an evil person will only reap evil. In the short term, it looks like they could reap success. Through their fraudulent means, they may reap a profit. From their dishonest gain, they may be able to build a house and an empire. But in the end, and we may not see that end, of course, in the end, they will reap what they have sown. If they have sown dishonor, they will reap it. If they have sown evil, they will reap it. If they have sown a mockery of God, they will reap it. As Galatians 6 testifies, you will reap what you sow. David wants to reap God's justice, and so he prays to God. He prays. That's what he does, and that's what we should do. And like Hebrews says, we let God be the actor of judgment. He may use us, yes, but it will never be something against his word. God may let them reap what they sow, but sometimes he does not. Sometimes he grants forgiveness. Praise be to God. And so one of the things that this psalm doesn't do, but we see in the New Testament more and more, is a prayerfulness for your enemies. For we eventually see that we are not that far removed from our enemies. We're all enemies of God. And so if we always reaped what we sowed, we would be destroyed. But if that person fails to come back into the hands of a loving God, the destruction that they have reaped, the sowing of, sadly, rejecting the Lord Jesus, will be reaped in their life. The boomerang of their sin, which Jesus took as we threw it, will actually come back and hit them. God doesn't want it to be so. Read verses 9 and 10 again. That's what he wants. All people will fear. They will proclaim the works of God and ponder what he has done. What has he done? He saved you through Jesus Christ. The righteous will rejoice and take refuge in him. And we know why. The boomerang sin didn't come back and hit us. Jesus grabbed hold of it and took it upon himself. We didn't reap what we'd sown. Thank goodness for that. Otherwise it'd all be destroyed. So pray for your enemies. Pray that they may turn and be forgiven before they sadly have no choice but to face the judgment of God.